That sort of directness that you're used to in Germany, which is seen as a great virtue, is not socially acceptable.
Bavarians will struggle.
It's the little things. It's about how, for example, you integrate just Guinness and leprechauns running around. You would ask, do you want tea? And he'd say no. And you'd think that that was the answer. Right? Yeah. Language in Ireland is not like that, right? Churchill said it. Why they don't want to be like us English, then everything is fine.
Ich begrüße euch zu einer neuen Folge von Perspektive Ausland. Heute wollen wir über das Thema Irland sprechen und vor allen Dingen natürlich auch über unser Seminar Auswandern nach Irland, das wir regelmäßig veranstalten und auch demnächst wieder veranstalten werden. Details auf unserer Webseite, Link dazu in der Beschreibung dieses Videos. Das Seminar findet in Cork statt, 3 Tage lang ein intensives Seminarprogramm zum Thema Steuern, zum Thema Recht, zum Thema Auswandern nach Irland, aber wir werden auch die Natur Irlands erleben, das Leben in Irland, die Geschichte Irlands kennenlernen und jemand, der ebenfalls dabei sein wird bei diesem Seminar, der ist heute hier bei uns zu Gast. Es handelt sich um Sean O'Keefe. Einige werden ihn vielleicht kennen. Er ist der Host unseres YouTube-Kanals Things Visible and Invisible. Er ist selbst Ire. Er war auch schon beim letzten Seminar dabei, hat er sehr eindrucksvoll zum Thema irische Geschichte gesprochen. Heute möchte ich ihn zum Thema Irland interviewen, auch natürlich als jemand, der in Irland aufgewachsen ist. Er spricht leider kein Deutsch, das heißt, wir werden jetzt zu Englisch switchen. Many of you know Sean as host of Things Visible and Invisible. Sean and I have done a number of events together, including a previous Moving to Ireland seminar. And the conversations Sean sparked in the room stayed with people long after the event ended. They have told me so, that's how I know. We are now doing another Moving to Ireland seminar in Cork, and Sean will be with us again. So today I want to focus specifically on Ireland, a country that Sean obviously knows much better than I know. I mean, I lived in Ireland for a while. Sean grew up in Ireland. We want to talk about the myth, the realities, the psychology, the culture, and why this matters if you are thinking about moving to Ireland. Sean, thank you for doing this.
No, thank you, Sebastian.
People thinking about moving to Ireland often have a very romanticized image about the place. From your perspective, what's real and what's fantasy?
Well, the first thing to say is that there are 2 Irelands, essentially, at the moment anyway. There's one island, but there are 2 jurisdictions. And one has about 80%, 85% of the landmass, and then the other has what it has. One is in the EU, very much in the EU, very much part of the EU. The mindset is very much the EU. The northern 6 counties are still within the UK. And as we know through Brexit, the UK exited the EU. So we have this kind of, I mean, if you couldn't complicate Irish history or Irish political topography more, there are 2 jurisdictions there. And the other thing is this, that over the last 30 to 40 years, because of the troubles, the actual differences in terms of the 2 jurisdictions are continually disappearing. So, for example, and I know a lot of people watching this come from German-speaking countries. I'm thinking especially of somewhere like Switzerland or parts of Switzerland, where they're very used to borders, right? They're very used to traveling, not just between international borders, but also linguistic borders, cultural borders. I mean, when we were in Switzerland, we were talking to people who, knew the French speaking and the German speaking, the Italian speaking, and so on. People might be surprised when they arrive in Ireland and say, well, there's 2 jurisdictions, but actually I can't really tell the difference other than maybe the signposts are a little bit different. Or one you can pay in euros. You can still use euros in the north. Like any country, it's true of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, there's a sort of stereotype that people have of countries, and that can be positive or negative, but the reality is often very different, and the lived reality, and that's what we're talking about here when people emigrate somewhere, the lived reality can often be markedly different from what you expected, however, in some of the strangest ways.
What do outsiders misunderstand most about Irish culture then?
I mean, they get some things absolutely right. The Irish are, I'm talking in gross stereotypes here, but they are naturally sociable people, very family orientated, fiercely loyal to their country or their county or their parish or whatever it happens to be. I think what they probably underestimate, though, is how the weight of history also plays its part in constantly shaping that identity. So as in German-speaking countries, history has shaped the identity. There's things which Irish people have been reluctant, I suppose, maybe to talk about at times because they're painful subjects. And yet these things very much shape the way in which people interact. It's a bit like when you visit a family relative, Sebastian, and everybody gets out the best cutlery and, they're nicely dressed. And you get an impression of people when you're visiting them, and it's often very positive. But you and I know that the reality of people's lives is often much more complicated than that. And one of the things I would say about emigrating to any country, and Ireland is no different from this, that it's much more complicated in a sense, the lived reality of living in a new environment. And Ireland is no different from Germany or Austria or Panama or Texas or whatever it happens to be. The other thing I would just say, Germany is a very large country, very large population. And if you include all the German speakers, you have a large sense. The total population of Ireland is only 7 million. However, it's an island. That 7 million, to my mind, can sometimes appear like 700 million. Do you know what I mean? Because we've talked about this off air, but the difference between, say, one county and another, and one part of a county and another, and the way that they look at each other and their accents are slightly different. Now, to the outsider, it all probably looks very parochial, but you got to remember that in Ireland, it's a continent to many Irish people, not a country.
When we ran that seminar together in Cork last year, did you notice people arriving, with the, say, idealized image of Ireland? Did you pick up on that in conversations?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that surprised them all, it surprised me as well, actually, was the weather. Because we had 3 days and it was October. It was beautiful weather. It was beautiful. It was sunny. It was warm, bright, and people were coming up to me saying, is this Ireland? Because the stereotype was that we're all living under lashings of rain and dark clouds, and that, which some of the time we were, but on those, I mean, it just shows that the climate on the Atlantic, it's changeable, and you can have some great weather, and then you can have some dull and dismal weather. So your audience is too sophisticated for simplistic sort of stereotypes. I mean, they weren't sort of expecting just Guinness and leprechauns running around or something like that. They were open to having any kind of preconditions or pre-thoughts, pre-stereotypes sort of blasted away. And they were very engaged. I mean, your audience or your seminar participants, they had already come, and I don't know if this is a German thing, but they'd already come kind of prepared, They had a number of questions, a number of topics that they wanted to explore about the history or about the culture. And they were often asking very specific questions, why did this happen? Or how did this come about? And that was, for my purposes, that was absolutely fantastic because, you had an audience which were very engaged, but also came with very intelligent questions that you wanted to try to answer. So I think the stereotypes were a bit on the low level because I think there's an element where the Germans have romanticized Ireland, but to an extent where some haven't really investigated what the reality is beyond it. So I think people were open to something new.
A lot of things visible and invisible is about seeing past surface narratives. Do you think Ireland is often misunderstood because people engage more with the story than with the reality?
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot of Irish history which has been propagandized one way or t'other. Certainly growing up in Northern Ireland, it was quite common and quite comical sometimes to see outsiders, because whichever side of the fence you were on, the side of the house, as we say, you were on, outsiders were always very welcome. However, there was a little bit of a catch to that, and that was always trying to get the outsiders to take our side, whatever your side was, right? So there's a very funny, I know some of your audience has watched Derry Girls, and I think you've watched it as well, and it's got an international appeal, Derry Girls, but there's a very funny, the girls are at their school and they have this headmistress who's a nun, sister, whatever it is, and she's welcoming some foreign group or something, says, welcome, and you only need to know one thing: we're the goodies, we were the good guys, the other guys not so good,
Don't worry yourselves too much about the whole civil war, sectarian conflict carry on. There's really only one thing you need to know. We're the goodies.
I think, you get that in any conflict situation or even post-conflict situation, less so today probably, but certainly during a conflict situation, we see it unfortunately in certain parts of the world at the moment where people are trying to sort of convince them that we're the good guys and all the problem lies on the other side. That was interesting to start to look at that and dislodge some of that, maybe. Differentiate between what is hard fact and what is propaganda, and history is always disputed. The other thing, though, which was very refreshing, is that all the participants understood that because of the history of Central Europe. They understood the idea of borders shifting. They understood the idea of people being transplanted in different parts and sort of being ethnically one thing, but behind a border that was something else. So I found that German people, in a way that, say, French wouldn't get it, the Germans got it straight away because of the history of the German. And there were an awful lot of connections that we were making about German history and Irish history in that regard. What seems on the surface to be very distinct and very different sort of histories, but below it about, as I say, revolutions, emigrations, how the immigration experience impacted at home, the industrialization, how that also then affected people, but then how wars and regimes changed borders. And also we had the experience, which some in the room had, of the DDR as opposed to the Federal Republic. So they were immediately able to understand some of the problems, some of the ways in which we're dealing with the complexities of Irish history through a German lens.
Now, you grew up in Belfast in a Catholic environment. Do people assume they already know your views because of that?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most frustrating thing. Nobody likes, doesn't matter where you come from, that you're in a social setting and people assume A, B, and C. So before you've opened your mouth, they assume A, B, and C. Very early on, when I came to live in England, when I was very young, I realized that there was very little point in talking about any of this with people because A, they didn't really understand it, and B, there was a real lack of knowledge about. Also, people aren't that interested, let's be honest. Other people's geopolitical problems are their own. So the interesting thing was that, however, that whenever people from Northern Ireland or Ireland are together, they tend to then sort of end up talking endlessly to each other, I suppose working out their own stuff together. I think that idea of stereotypes and preconditions is very frustrating, regardless of where you come from. And I think part of the seminars, or one of the joys of the seminars, was actually sort of not just unpacking it for me, but helping other people maybe to free themselves of some of these things, saying, well, where do these things come from? What says that because you've come from such and such a place, from such and such a background, that you've got to think in this way, that your life's path is determined in this way? That's the most frustrating thing about these things. It's not that people come and think that, because you come from here, you've got this view. That I get. But it's whenever that becomes that because you come from there and you're from that background, that will mean that this is the limit to whatever it is that you're going to do, achieve, or whatever it is. And I think that was one of the things that was very interesting to explode on the seminars, that so much of what we're carrying is preordained, given to us. And really, at some point in our lives, we have to look at it and say, well, actually, how much of this is real? How much of it's propaganda? And how much of it does it affect me?
I think it's definitely fair to say that a good number of attendees of the seminars were surprised by your views on Irish history, and that includes me. Why do you think that is?
Because Irish history is complicated. Irish history is very complicated, and the other thing is that Irish history has been propagandized from both sides for the last 100 years, and I grew up in the middle of it, so I had first-hand experience of what I thought was history, which was pure propaganda. And this is not unusual to Ireland. Every country has this, there's the official version, then the truth, I guess, or whatever we want to call the truth. And as you talked at the start, things visible and invisible is often looking at official narratives and then what the messiness, the complicated messiness of what's actually the lived reality of people or what actually happened. So history is complicated. History, as you know, and it's said often, is written by the victors. So it keeps moving around. The danger is when you, first of all, think that history is a fixed entity. Secondly, that it's not something which isn't infected one way or t'other by propaganda. So it's sometimes good to go back to some what I termed inconvenient facts which pop up in Irish history. But also life's complicated. Maybe that's the other thing. History is just the collective history of a people. But the history that we all have individually is complicated because we are complicated people. We have many different emotions. We are affected by environments, past, present, and possibly future. So we shouldn't be surprised that history is complicated. In fact, I think it's one of the joys when you start sort of playing around with history as opposed to pure propaganda and say, well, actually, how does this then relate? Why have we ended up in this situation? But the other thing which we started to discuss more on the seminar recently about Irish history was how Irish history is constantly evolving and changing, and the Irish political scene is constantly evolving and changing in ways which even I wouldn't have foreseen 5 or 6 years, 10 years ago. That's probably also something which German people can relate to, because you've gone through a number of seismic changes in the last 30 to 40 years in terms of the geopolitical structures, and it's not over yet. So, yeah.
My personal experience from Ireland, and I can say the same, is pretty much true about Scotland, is that obviously, yes, we can say the British, or should I say the English, certainly made mistakes in the way they handled Irish affairs or Scottish affairs. And, there were also obviously nasty things the English did. But nevertheless, in both countries, I feel remembering history and building identity is often done around grievances. In Ireland and in Scotland as well. But let's talk about Ireland. Do you agree with that?
I think there's something in that. I mean, some people might say, well, we've got plenty to be grieved. There's a good reason for grievance. Depending on which side, current Irish political scene, certainly in Northern Ireland, less so today, thankfully, but certainly at the height of the Troubles, was all grievance. All the problems were on the other side. If only the other side, they're the cause of all the problems. And then they would say the same about us, and it was backwards and forwards, and there was a constant grievance. And then it was obviously the interference of England and da-da-da-da-da. And then it was the South wouldn't do this and they wouldn't do that. And it was constant grievance, right? It's probably not unique to a smaller country, which is overshadowed politically and economically by a larger entity, which is why you also have similar elements of this in Scotland and Wales, because England is just such a huge entity politically and economically and socially. So you have this constant kind of sense of grievance. However, things have changed. The Republic of Ireland, Southern Ireland, hasn't had the excuse of English grievance for well over 100 years, and has really orientated itself much more globally in an international sense through the EU, but not exclusively through the EU. What the EU did, and I'm not even sure they were aware that this was going to happen, it kind of moved the Republic of Ireland out of the shadow of Britain, something which it had lived under for hundreds of years. So it suddenly became this kind of, it became part of a larger political entity in a very freeing sense. Now, I know the EU comes in for a lot of criticism on the seminars, and I'm no great fan of the EU, but for a small country like the Republic of Ireland, it was a way in which it sort of began to find its identity in a wider political sense. Now, remember, it joined in 1973 alongside the UK. It was joining an economic union as opposed to a political union, and it was very, very happy to do so. That said, I would say that the Republic of Ireland has become this huge flag waver for the EU, one of the most enthusiastic EU participants. I think there was a recent survey I was looking at on Irish media which said that 85% of the population think the EU is a great thing. So it's one of those elements which has changed the landscape, the political, not just the economic landscape. However, what has happened, and this is why I'm talking about it's constantly changing, what has happened in the last, say, 2 or 3 years, as recent as that, is that we have had the first murmurings against the European Union within the 26 counties within the Republic of Ireland. And there is now this kind of narrative beginning to build up, which we've had certainly in the UK for many, many decades, and it came to its conclusion at Brexit, which is this idea that the European Union is a super state, that it is somehow, transplanting its ideas into Ireland, and there's no democracy to it, there's no justification for it, it's some sort of tyrannical entity. All the stuff that we know, all the stuff that's pretty common across different European states, be they in the EU or outside the EU. For the first time, we're starting to see that begin to coalesce as an opinion in Ireland, and it will start to, and it already has, create political parties. Now, they're very nascent at the moment, they're not creating any waves, but it's the beginning of something. And it feeds into something which we certainly talked about in the seminar, which is that there is something in the Irish psyche which is very rebellious, right? And it rebelled against the British Empire. Now, the British Empire, many people in the British Empire were saying, I mean, Churchill said it, he said, the thing we don't understand about the Irish is why they don't want to be like us English. I.e., why they don't want to be part of the empire, why they don't want to participate. In fact, there's a story that when the treaty was signed in 1921, Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister, took Michael Collins, who was the rebel leader at the time, into a room and showed him a map of the world, of the British Empire. And he said, you could be part of this, you know. And that tells you more about the English psyche than the Irish psyche. The Irish do not think in those kind of terms, because what the Irish are thinking of, well, why are you dominating all these people? Why don't you let them all be on their own type thing? So there's an element where the EU has got to the point now where it could become the bogeyman for a lot of Irish people, that all its problems, all the Irish, going back to grievance, all the Irish grievances will now start to be aimed at the European Union, which would be, you know, logical, but also slightly comical that we've ended up in that. What I'm trying to say is that it's good to drill down to what are the kind of key components of a national psyche, as much as anybody can determine that. I'm sure there's things that you've thought about living abroad, as you have for many years, about the German psyche and how that informs certain things, and there's positives, there's also negatives. The Irish, and I speak for myself in this, we need to be careful about always finding the grievance in the larger entity. Shakespeare, I think in Julius Caesar, says it better when they were talking about the plot to assassinate Julius Caesar, and they were saying, well, you know, they were talking about the stars and was the timing right? And one of them said that the fault lies not in the stars, but in ourselves. And there's an element whereby as well that, especially on these seminars, not to put too much store by whatever the large entity that we feel is creating all the problems for us, be it the European Union or World Economic Forum or whatever it happens to be. Because at the end of the day, we have to take responsibility for who we are and what we want to do. And I think that that's a challenge, not just for Irish people or German people, but for all of us, that we somehow own what we have, where we've come from, but not let it determine where we're going.
In our most recent seminar, very interestingly, you used the Irish rap band, hip-hop band Kneecap as an example that illustrates the points you were just making. Why did you use Kneecap?
Kneecap is a fascinating example of, in some ways, it crystallizes the relationship between England and Ireland in this sense. So Kneecap, for anybody who doesn't know, and I didn't know who they were until they started hitting the press, a rap band. They were relatively successful, I guess, in their own little world, but, you know, I'd never heard of them. But they made some statements about the Israeli-Gaza situation, and the British authorities decided they were going to prosecute them under terrorism legislation. Now, this is a red rag to a bull for any Irishman, right? Especially this rap band comes from West Belfast, you know, so they immediately became like total folk heroes, you know, because the British state was, you know, the weight of the British state was being brought down on, there's three of them, you know. So they became these kind of huge folk heroes, and then everybody on a certain side of an Irish political spectrum was behind them, supporting them, and they became, and they got a lot of support over on this side of the Irish Sea as well. A lot of people in Britain were behind them and in America, because they were the little guy against the big guy, you know, against the faceless bureaucracy that was going to punish them. This feeds so much into so much of Irish history. You know, it was really, they were turning the key. So, I mean, from a financial perspective, it was fantastic for Kneecap. Their sales went through the roof. Their Spotify account went from 100,000 to 1,100,000. So, I mean, it was fantastic. And I mean, people like me had never heard of them. Suddenly we're all watching their videos and who were these guys? And they're actually very articulate. They're very funny. I played one of the videos at the seminar. I mean, they rap in English and Irish, and there's a lot of Belfast slang. So the whole thing is a bit of a joke. I mean, it's actually very surreal in a sense, and very funny if you understand the joke. They were prosecuted by the state, and then the British authorities took them to a court in London, not far from where we are, and the case was thrown out on a technicality. The British state had somehow made a mistake in the warrant or something. So, of course, they come out of the court almost carried out as heroes, you know. Their mantra is they have fought the British state and they have won, you know. So what has happened in that little story, or that vignette, is that the British state, through total ineffectiveness, has turned a rap band into an international sensation and increased their sales endlessly and allowed everybody to be totally grievance focused and said, well, that just shows you, you know, they're picking on these three young men, this sort of thing. So it's a funny story about how the difference between England and Ireland, if British authorities had simply said, we're not interested in giving these people publicity, we're not going to prosecute them, we're probably not going to get a conviction, what is the point? And left it at that, nobody would have heard of Kneecap. But they didn't do that. And instead, Kneecap got what they wanted, which was great publicity, folk hero status, and the sales are continuing to this day.
I mean, in my mind, as like a foreigner, you know, who is familiar with both countries, watching that, I find absolutely startling. Why is this possible that both sides often end up reinforcing the same old, I want to say, hundreds of years old narrative loops?
Well, it's partly because of who we are, but also there's a saying, I think it was in the film Michael Collins, that the Irish never forget their history and the English never remember it. If somebody had come to me from the Crime Prosecution Service, I would have said, you know, you're treading in very deep waters here now on Irish history, and I'll explain why. And I've gone through all the kind of psychological stuff. And the fact is that Kneecap would have never backed down, not because they're stubborn, but because of the weight of what's coming at them, you know. There's too much history in Ireland and there's too little understanding in England. One of the things when I came to live in England when I was very young, I was very shocked that I knew more about English history than most English people I met, which was surprising. It's partly that, but it's also partly understanding psyche. And whether you're talking politics, whether you're talking culture, or whether you're talking business and emigration, it's very important to understand the psyche of people.
Now, if you talk about that, now, as we said, we do the seminars for people looking to move to Ireland very seriously, you know, looking into this, planning their move to Ireland. Why is it important that these people understand the cultural psychology that's going on here? Why does that actually matter?
Whether you're German moving to Ireland or Irish moving to Germany, or whether you're moving to Panama, Texas, Philippines, wherever it happens to be, there is a danger in those moves, and that is that you move to another country and you expect it to be somehow similar to whatever it is you left behind. And I mean, the Irish have moved all around the world, and we are the worst sometimes at transplanting our own culture, be it Irish bars and Irish sports and Irish churches, whatever it is, we try to transplant them, and that's a perfectly normal thing to do. And in the 19th century, be it Germans emigrating to the United States or Italians or Poles or Irish or whatever it happened to be, there was an element where you took your culture with you. You became Little Italy or Little Ireland or Little Poland or whatever it happened to be. In the modern world, it's probably not, you're not able to do that. And what we're dealing with, certainly with people who are at the seminar, we're not talking about large influxes of certain villages or certain regions that are moving to Ireland from Germany, which did happen actually in the 17th century. The Palatine Germans, large scale moving to Ireland. So you're dealing often with individuals moving, and that heightens, in a sense, that idea that you're moving into a foreign culture. Now, there'll be certain things, because it's EU, for example, there'll be certain things which are familiar, or certain things you will understand because that's how it was in Germany. But they're not the things that people were picking up on when I was with them in the seminar. What they were picking up on were the things that just completely blindsided them. This is how we do things in Germany, but then they realized, actually, this is not how we do things in Ireland. What was very funny, for example, was listening to those kind of experiences. One experience that came across, I thought, well, if you'd asked me, I would have told you that's exactly what would have happened. Do you know what I mean? Some of the exposure I've had to German people, I can see certain characteristics which are very, very different from how Irish people interact. And people need to be aware of this. You know, it's not that one is right and one is wrong. I'm not saying that, but people just need to be aware that it's different if you go to another country. So I think it's the little things. I don't think it's the big things. I think bureaucracy is the same, whether it's Germany or Ireland. I think officialdom or buying a house or some legalities, people kind of get around that quite easily. It's the little things. It's about how, for example, you integrate into an Irish community from Germany, for example.
Give us an example. I mean, you often talk about Germans being direct in that sense. So give us an example, for example, about directness, how that is maybe different with Irish people?
Well, we had some fun of this on the last seminar because I was learning a lot about the different regions, the different states in Germany. For example, I was talking about German directness and then saying, yes, but these are the really direct Germans. You know, the Bavarians, for example, are the really direct Germans. And this was really amusing. And I was listening to it and then I thought, well, actually, this is not how things operate in Ireland. Every country has sometimes a region where you think people are a bit more abrupt than other parts of it. But personal communication, I guess, or communal communication in Ireland is heightened in a sense. You know, what I was picking up from some of the participants was that they're conveying information. I don't like you. I like you. We go here. We don't. And it was very sort of bump. It was very staccato, right? Whereas language in Ireland is not like that, right? So as I think you were alluding to a wonderful example of, I think it was the parish priest turning up at your house and you'd have this roundabout discussion, right? And do you want tea or do you not want tea? And you would ask, do you want tea? And he'd say no. And you'd think that was the answer, right? Yeah. And then we had a laugh about it because there's a kind of a dance where the first answer is no, I won't have tea. And then you're supposed to respond with, of course you'll have tea, or go on, you will have tea. And then it comes back and then there's a to and fro. And then the person says, okay, I'll have tea, as if to say, I'm giving in to your, great generosity. And there's this kind of sort of linguistic dance. When we were talking to the Bavarians about this, and I'm not picking on Bavarians, but it was like, this is very strange. This is very new. What is this? So it was this way in which it's not just information giving; it's a way of creating an ambience.
In that sense, do you think, for example, Bavarians will struggle in Ireland while others might not so? Or, who do you think will have it, would be successful in Ireland, who can integrate successfully in Irish society, who will find it difficult?
Well, I'm not going to pick on the Bavarians. I met some very nice Bavarians when I was at your last seminar. I think German and Irish people naturally get on very well, but they get on very well because of their differences.
And they're both not British, right? So,
well, leaving that aside, because that lasts for about 5 minutes, it's more about the difference of the way of approaching. So, for example, I remember an uncle of mine working with Germans back in the 70s, and he couldn't speak highly enough of them. And we asked him about different other nationalities. And to be honest, the English he didn't mind. But he said some of these people from this county, right, in Ireland, or those people from this part of Ireland, And it was kind of interesting that the people who are part of the family, if you like, are the people you always moan about. But it's actually these people who were so different, but so kind of straightforward, easy to work with, hardworking, all the positives that we know in some stereotypes of German people. I think what I would say is that it's not that you will struggle with it, but you have to understand the kind of language, the kind of topography that you're moving in is different from Germany, and in some ways more different than maybe you expected. But if you can get over that hump, I think that then very quickly you will find yourself at home and probably smothered in kindness and hospitality. We had an example on the Cork seminar of a man who had moved to Ireland with his family. He had some very funny stories about the differences between the German mentality and the Irish mentality. But the thing that he said, which really touched me, was that he couldn't get over how kind people were, how affable they were, how they wanted to help him. And there was no angle. There's no side to it. And because he was an outsider in a way, they were even more willing to help him, to try to help him to integrate in. And I mean, what we're talking about is some of the sort of the fun of being in another culture and making mistakes and all of that. But once you get over that, I think that Irish people and German people get on very well together, partly because of what you're alluding to. There's not enough of a history. There has been some immigration of Germans to Ireland and some of Irish to Germany, but not enough to really create some kind of history, some sort of, there's a little bit of the unknown. The stereotypes of the Germans in Ireland are almost all positive. So when the Germans come to Ireland, they're often coming with positive stereotypes and we're meeting them with positive stereotypes. So everybody seems to get on. And as I say, it's the differences that actually help bring it all together. So if you're emigrating to Ireland, if you're thinking about emigrating to Ireland, if you just understand the differences, and it's just understanding them. that Irish people will use language in a way that maybe Germans don't. That sort of directness that you're used to in Germany, which is seen as a great virtue, is not socially acceptable really in Ireland. You have to temper that a little bit. You maybe go, you can say it, but you can say it in a different way. Then everything is fine.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, for this very insightful conversation. We look very much forward to having you again in our next seminar, Moving to Ireland. Also, wie gesagt, der Sean wird auch das nächste Mal dabei sein, wenn wir unser Seminar veranstalten, Auswandern nach Irland. Wie gesagt, in Cork Termine auf unserer Webseite, Link dazu in der Beschreibung zu diesem Video. Dort wird Sean dann natürlich noch viel intensiver und ausführlicher über die irische Geschichte reden und die Themen, die er jetzt gerade eben hier auch angesprochen hat. Wenn du dir überlegst, nach Irland umzuziehen, dann ist dieses Seminar auf jeden Fall sehr hilfreich für dich. Da lässt du alles zum Thema Steuern, Steuervorteile in Irland, auch die steuerlichen Herausforderungen, die es gibt, wenn du von Deutschland ins Ausland ziehst, wie zum Beispiel die Wegzugsteuer. Wir lernen über den Non-Dom-Status, über Homeschooling, Immobilien, Banken und auch natürlich, wie du den irischen Pass erwerben kannst, einer der stärksten Staatsbürgerschaften, die es überhaupt nur gibt. In diesem Sinne würde ich mich freuen, dich in Irland begrüßen zu dürfen. Ansonsten natürlich gerne auch ein Beratungsgespräch buchen. Thank you very much, Sean, for this conversation. Und schaut euch seinen Kanal an, bitte. Er ist sehr faszinierend. Things Visible and Invisible. Link dazu in der Beschreibung dieses Videos.
Bist du Unternehmer, Freiberufler oder Investor? Zieht es dich schon lange ins Ausland? Mach heute den ersten konkreten Schritt in eine Zukunft mit mehr Geld und mehr Freiheit. Buche ein Beratungsgespräch mit Sebastian und seinen Kollegen. Unsere Kanzlei unterstützt Mandanten wie dich dabei, deine Steuerlast legal zu reduzieren, Vermögen aufzubauen und zu schützen und deine persönliche Freiheit zu maximieren. Profitiere jetzt von unserem Fachwissen und unserem Netzwerk. Gehe zu mandatierung.com und werde Mandant unserer Kanzlei.